first video we're just going to have a look at what's meant by environmental policy, why it's needed, and why climate change is a source of market failure. So in terms of the study design, as I said in class, you need to be able to explain one environmental policy and how it's influencing aggregate supply. We're going to talk about the carbon tax and emissions trading scheme as past policies and renewable energy target as a current policy, although this policy was never implemented. So you need to be aware of what environmental policies are, why climate change is a source of market failure, some potential costs of climate change, and then the differences between carbon tax, emissions trading scheme, and renewable energy target, and how they all target climate change. So in terms of the definition of environmental policy, they include all government actions, so we're talking about the government still, to reduce the incidence of negative externalities and conserve the natural environment for our long-term economic prosperity. This term, economic prosperity, this is referring to things like not hurting our environment, not getting into too much debt, so that the living standards of future generations are maximised. So, environmental policies, all government actions to reduce the incidence of negative externalities and promote the environment and the long-term economic prosperity of Australians. And the idea of these policies is to boost our future productive capacity by reducing the incidence of things that are affecting agriculture, affecting our ability to produce, and hurting industries like tourism and agriculture. Most of these policies will have a short-term negative impact on the economy, but in the long term they will reduce negative externalities and promote our living standards. So the need for environmental policies is because our material consumption is unsustainable. We continue to burn fossil fuels, which are polluting the atmosphere and increasing the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is heating our globe. The problems with heating the globe, again, it's not all proven, but it can lead to increased cyclones, increased droughts, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. And this is all going to lead to national output being reduced and hurting our material and non-material living standards. So the aim of any environmental policy is to try and internalise the negative externality. So they're trying to put a price on our negative externalities or the pollution that we're causing in the environment that can hurt our living standards and international competitiveness. And by doing that, it should help to preserve our aggregate supply in the long term, partly because it will reduce the incidence of natural disasters, but it should also mean that using renewable energy is actually cheaper once you've put up with the high initial setup costs. That will help to lower firms' cost of production and in the long term help to improve the non-material living standards of society as well. So just a little bit of a recap is to what is meant by a market failure. So it's when the market, without government intervention, or you could say the unregulated market, leads to an inefficient allocation of resources, so society's welfare is not maximised. Climate change is an example of a market failure because the free market has led to an over-allocation of resources related to non-renewable energy sources. Why climate change is a market failure? Because producers and consumers acting in their own interests are causing carbon emissions, so you need to be able to say this, that are being put into the environment and are leading to negative impacts for third parties, which are going to be externalised onto third parties, and these are social costs. When you're explaining why climate change is a market failure, it's important to say these terms at the start, that both it's in production and consumption, and that it's causing carbon emissions into the environment. Then you need to be able to link it to some of these concepts, so it can lead to hurricanes and typhoons, heat waves, droughts, tropical diseases. You need to make reference to some of these key concepts. It can also lead to bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef. So that's your first mark. Your second mark is here, and your third mark is not only being able to list some of these things, but then be able to link them to our long-term national output and our long-term growth. So it's not enough to say climate change is a market failure because people acting in their own self-interest will cause more carbon emissions, and this will lead to tropical diseases and drier summers and bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef. You then need to say this is going to hurt our material living standards because it will lead to reduced national output. It can hurt our sustainable growth rates and therefore reduce the material living standards of society or future generations. So in terms of an answer, explain why climate change is considered to be a market failure. It relates to the free market resulting in inefficient allocation of resources because consumers and producers acting in their own self-interest are ignoring the third-party costs on future generations. Climate change is a negative externality in both production and consumption that leads to future generations suffering from cyclones, droughts, poorer growing conditions, which will reduce output, so you need to include this bit here, increase prices, and reduce both our material and non-material living standards. So point 1, point 2, the links to the environment, and then point 3, linking that back to national output and our future living standards.